Hello and welcome back to Diplomacy and Discourse. I'm your host AR and I'm truly glad you've joined me today. This episode tackles one of the biggest questions in international relations. How do we resolve conflicts that seem impossible to resolve? We're talking about disputes that have lasted decades, wars that keep flaring up, and divisions so deep that peace feels like a fantasy. But here's the thing. Peace is not a fantasy. It's a craft. It takes different tools for different situations, and no single method works everywhere. Today, we're going to walk through the diverse paths people and nations are using right now in 2026 to build peace in some of the world's most difficult places. We'll look at superpower diplomacy, truth commissions, African-led mediation, democratic transitions, grassroots negotiation, and even what a talking stick in the U.S. Senate can teach us about resolving conflict. Along the way, I'll share real-world life lessons from each case, lessons that apply whether you're navigating a geopolitical crisis or a disagreement in your own community. Let's get started. Before we look at solutions, let's understand why conflicts stick around. One of the most important ideas in this field comes from scholar Edward Azar, whose work on protracted social conflicts showed that the worst, longest-lasting disputes are not just about territory or power. They're about identity, racial, ethnic, religious, and cultural identity, combined with weak governance, inequality, and exclusion. Think of it like a house with a cracked foundation. You can't repaint the walls and fix the roof. But if the foundation isn't addressed, the cracks keep spreading. When a government systematically excludes or disadvantages a group, whether it's the Kurds in Turkey, Albanians in Serbia, or Armenians in Azerbaijan, those groups eventually push back. And if democratic channels are blocked, the pushback can turn violent. This is why scholars distinguish between two kinds of peace. Negative peace simply means the guns have stopped, like sending two fighting siblings into their room without figuring out what started the argument. Positive peace means actually addressing the root causes: inequality, injustice, lack of representation, and historical trauma. Most of the world's frozen conflicts sit in that uncomfortable space of negative peace. The violence has paused, but the underlying grievances are still simmering. That's why we need diverse approaches, because each conflict has its own unique foundation to repair. Let's start at the top. Big power diplomacy. Right now, the Middle East is the most active theater for high-stakes negotiations. As of May 2026, at least 3 major diplomatic tracks are running simultaneously. First, the Gaza peace process. After the U.S. proposed a 20-point peace deal in late 2025, the first phase saw progress. Israel confirmed the return of all hostages in January 2026. But the second phase, involving long-term demilitarization and reconstruction, has stalled over disputes about Hamas's disarmament and continuing military operations. Second, Israel and Lebanon entered U.S.-brokered direct talks following renewed hostilities. A fragile 10-day cessation of hostilities was established in April 2026, with the ambitious goal of disarming non-state armed groups, a goal that has eluded the region for decades. Third, the U.S. and Iran are engaged in indirect negotiations, mediated by Pakistan and Qatar, to end their war that began in February 2026 and has severely disrupted global oil supplies. Iran wants an end to blockades. The U.S. insists on nuclear programs limits. It's a classic case of deeply entrenched positions. What ties all three together is the top-down diplomatic model. A superpower uses its political and economic leverage to bring parties to the table, phase agreements around ceasefires, and tie security arrangements to economic reconstruction packages. The life lesson: superpower-led diplomacy can force a pause in violence and create frameworks for peace, but it cannot guarantee lasting results on its own. Agreements hold only when the parties on the ground genuinely commit to hard compromises, and when underlying grievances are addressed, not papered over. Now let's shift from stopping active wars to healing old wounds. In 2026, several countries are using Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or TRCs, to confront painful histories. South Korea relaunched its TRC in February 2026 to investigate state violence during the Korean War era. Finland published the final report of its Sami Truth and Reconciliation Commission in January 2026, sparking calls for a formal state apology and stronger Indigenous rights. And in Canada, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation continues preserving the testimony of residential school survivors and is planning a new permanent home for those records. These commissions aren't about punishing individuals. They're about creating an official, honest account of what happened. They give victims a platform to tell their stories, recommend reparations, and propose reforms to prevent the same abuses from happening again. Think of it like a family that has never talked about a traumatic event. The silence doesn't make the pain disappear. It just forces everyone to work around it. TRCs break that silence at a national level. The life lesson is that sustainable peace requires more than the absence of war. It demands a courageous reckoning with the past, officially acknowledging injustice, and giving voice to survivors are essentially steps for healing, even decades after the events occurred. You can't build a healthy future on a foundation of denial. One of the most important shifts in peace building is the growing emphasis on regional ownership. In Africa, this takes the form of the principle African solutions to African problems. The Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo has been one of the world's deadliest conflict zones for years. Previous mediation efforts were fragmented, multiple diplomatic tracks running in parallel, which allowed warring parties to play mediators against each other. In February 2026, the African Union's Peace and Security Council made a decisive move. They consolidated the separate Nairobi and Luanda mediation processes under a single framework and appointed President Faure Gnassingbé of Togo as the lead AU mediator, supported by a panel of facilitators. The goal: de-escalate violence, secure an immediate cessation of hostilities, and address hate speech and civilian displacement through coordinated regional pressure. This approach reflects a strategic insight. When there are too many cooks in the kitchen, nobody eats. By unifying mediation under one respected continental figure, the AU created coherent pressure instead of scattered good intentions. And here's the life lesson. In complex regional conflicts, a fragmented mediation landscape often empowers warring parties to avoid commitments. A unified process with clear leadership is critical. Whether you are resolving a border war or managing a dispute between departments at work, one clear process beats 5 overlapping ones. Sometimes the hardest part of peace isn't stopping the fighting. It's building what comes after. In the Philippines, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BARMM, is about to hold its first ever parliamentary elections, scheduled for September 2026. This election is the capstone of the 2014 peace agreement between the Philippines government and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. For years, the region has been governed by an appointed interim body. The upcoming election represents the transition from a conflict-era power structure to a democratically elected government. But the road hasn't been smooth. There have been legal challenges before the Supreme Court, lingering mistrust between the MILF and the national government, and concerns about localized violence. In April 2026, the Philippine government launched a major joint effort with the Elections Commission and security forces to ensure a safe and credible vote. This is what peace building looks like in practice: messy, slow, and full of setbacks, but moving forward. The election won't solve every problem in Mindanao, but it represents something powerful: the belief that ballots can replace bullets. The life lesson is that signing a peace agreement is not the end of a peace process. It is the beginning. The real test is whether former enemies can build institutions that allow them to compete politically instead of militarily. Peace is not a moment. It is a long construction project. Colombia offers one of the most instructive and humbling case studies of 2026. President Gustavo Petro launched his ambitious Total Peace Initiative to negotiate simultaneously with all remaining armed groups. The idea was bold. Instead of picking off one group at a time, address all sources of violence at once. It worked in one sense. Direct clashes between state forces and armed groups decreased, but it backfired in another. The reduction in state military pressure created a power vacuum that groups like the ELN exploited. They expanded their territorial control and illicit economies. Intergroup violence actually increased, and civilian targeting and forced displacement rose. The nationwide ceasefire with the ELN collapsed in early 2025 after a humanitarian crisis caused by fighting between armed factions. By 2026, public opinion had turned against the strategy, even as the government proposed resuming talks ahead of national elections. This is a paradox worth sitting with. A policy designed to reduce violence can inadvertently create new forms of insecurity if it doesn't account for the competitive dynamics between armed groups. The life lesson is peace is more than the absence of state-led conflict. An ambitious strategy to demobilize all armed actors at once can backfire if it fails to account for how rival groups behave when pressure is lifted. Good intentions need robust verification and enforcement mechanisms. Otherwise, ceasefires become opportunities for the wrong actors. Now let's zoom all the way in, from geopolitics to the everyday. Some of the most effective conflict resolution happens not in summit halls but in offices, communities, and even the U.S. Senate. Consider the third story approach from Harvard's program on negotiation. Instead of starting a difficult conversation from your perspective or the other person's, you start from the perspective of a neutral observer, a third story. A 2026 case study describes a sales manager who used this technique to resolve a recurring dispute about late reports. By framing the issue neutrally, the manager discovered that the colleague wasn't being lazy. They were prioritizing sales leads, which was actually in the company's interests. The result was a restructured workflow that solved the problem for both sides. Then there's the talking stick. During the 2018 U.S. government shutdown, Senator Susan Collins introduced a Native American talking stick into stalled bipartisan negotiations. The rule was simple. Only the person holding the stick could speak. It sounds almost too basic to work, but it did. It restored order, ensured everyone was heard, and helped the group reach a short-term agreement. These micro-level tools carry a macro-level truth. The life lesson is that process of a conversation often determines its substance. Simple tools that reduce defensiveness, ensure everyone is heard, and uncover underlying interests can transform intractable disputes into solvable problems, whether in an office or the halls of power. Before we close, I want to share 7 uncomfortable realities that anyone serious about peace needs to understand. These come from decades of conflict resolution research and practice. 1. Conflict management is not the same as conflict resolution. Keeping sides apart, like UN peacekeeping zones, prevents killing but doesn't address why the killing started. The demilitarized zone between North and South Korea is a perfect example. Negative peace sustained for over 70 years, with the underlying conflict still unresolved. 2. Negotiated solutions rarely produce optimal outcomes for anyone. Both sides enter expecting to win. The realistic goal is a compromise both can live with, not one that makes either side happy. 3. Third-party arbitration is almost always necessary. It's rare for conflicting parties to resolve deep grievances alone, but arbiters carry their own biases and interests, which can shape outcomes. 4. Gains are never zero-sum. If both sides are hardliners, a win-win framing can actually produce a lose-lose result, where the only real winners are the mediators who brokered the deal. 5. Solutions that stop wars can create new problems. Quick fix agreements may lead aggressors in control of captured territory. Rushing to end violence can weaken a state's internal dynamics and plant seeds for the next conflict. 6. The people who sign peace deals may not stay in power. Leaders who make concessions risk being replaced by hardliners who reject the agreement entirely. A peace deal must be robust enough to survive leadership changes. Lastly, number 7, promoting peace is not the same as practicing it. Signing a document means nothing without implementation, enforcement, and the political will to follow through, for generations, not just election cycles. So what's the big takeaway from all of this? There is no single formula for peace. Superpower diplomacy works in some contexts. Truth commissions work in others. Regional mediation, democratic institution building, grassroots dialogue, and creative negotiation tools each have their place. The common thread is this: peace is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice, ongoing, imperfect, and demanding. It requires understanding the specific history, culture, and power dynamics of each conflict. It requires patience measured in decades, not news cycles. And it requires all of us, not just diplomats and generals, but communities, educators, and ordinary citizens to participate. In 2026, we're seeing this principle in action everywhere. In Gaza and Lebanon, in Korean truth commissions, in the DRC's unified mediation, in Mindanao's elections, in Colombia's painful lessons, and even in a senator holding a talking stick. The world is messy, diverse, and full of disputes, but it is also full of people working stubbornly, creatively, and courageously to resolve the unresolvable. If you take one thing from this episode, let it be this: peace is a craft, not a miracle, and every one of us can learn its tools. Thank you for listening. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone. leave a review, and send your thoughts to diplomacyanddiscourse@gmail.com. Until next time, stay informed, stay hopeful, and keep building bridges.